It began in silence. The kind of silence that lives just before a storm when the air holds its breath. On the island of Tinian in the summer of 1944, a Japanese officer sat in a concrete cell, wrists bound tight, the rope stiff with salt and sweat. Outside, the sky trembled with the sound of engines. Dozens of American fighters thundered overhead, their shadows cutting across the island like black blades. Lieutenant Satoshi Endo had once believed in precision. For 2 years he had served the Imperial Japanese Navy's Intelligence Division, transmitting reports across the Pacific. Every figure he sent, range, speed, altitude, was meant to define the enemy. He believed his data shaped victory. He believed numbers could command the future. Now, beneath the dim light of captivity, he realized he had been wrong. Fatally wrong. The Americans knew it before he did. Endo's reports had underestimated the P-47 Thunderbolt. Tokyo had been told it was slow, limited in range, incapable of reaching deep Pacific positions. Commanders believed it was a blunt instrument, a brute of an aircraft meant only for short-range combat. And based on those numbers, his numbers, they planned accordingly. They fortified the wrong islands. They left others exposed. But the Thunderbolt was not what the numbers said it was. American engineers had quietly transformed it. New drop tanks extended its range beyond what Japanese analysts thought possible. Pilots learned to push its engine to limits no chart had ever predicted. The fighter that Tokyo dismissed as obsolete had become the spear of the U.S. air campaign. And by the time Japan realized it, it was too late. Endo's arrest had not come through brilliance but through chance. A Japanese convoy near Saipan had been struck by American bombers. In the wreckage, investigators found fragments of radio logs, strings of coded digits scattered among the debris. The Americans deciphered them line by line, until the pattern became clear. The Empire's intelligence network was not revealing truth. It was fabricating comfort. The realization spread quietly through Allied intelligence circles. Japanese spies were lying to themselves. Not deliberately but by habit. Reports were adjusted to fit expectation, to please superiors, to preserve face. Every falsified figure was a small act of loyalty that fed a growing blindness. The system demanded optimism. Reality was an inconvenience. Lieutenant Endo had believed he was serving the Emperor. In truth, he had been serving a machine that punished honesty. The data he had sent, numbers copied from nervous scouts, estimated from shadows and distance, had passed through layers of censorship and pride until the lies hardened into doctrine. He remembered the day he first heard of the Thunderbolt. Late 1943. A rumor passed between field agents about a new American fighter, heavier than anything they had seen. Tokyo dismissed it immediately. A machine that large could never maneuver well. It would never challenge the zero in the sky. But by 1944 the stories had changed. Pilots returning from the Mariana Front spoke of silver monsters diving at impossible speed, shrugging off hits that would have torn any Japanese plane apart. The stories were ignored. In his reports, Endo was told to omit anomalies. Command wanted consistency. So he obeyed. The numbers had to fit the narrative. In Washington, analysts studying those same reports saw something different. The Japanese estimates didn't align with field results. American loss rates dropped. Japanese fighters fell faster than before. The discrepancy hinted at a deeper truth. The enemy was fighting a war against its own illusions. Endo's capture came during one of the last desperate intelligence operations of Japan's Pacific campaign. His team had been transmitting from a hidden outpost when the convoy nearby was destroyed. He tried to destroy his radio before capture, but the Americans were faster. Within days he was in chains, facing interrogation in a humid bunker lit by one dim bulb. His interrogator was calm, almost polite. He asked not about secrets but about numbers. "You sent these figures?" he asked, sliding a sheet across the table. Endo nodded. The man's voice never rose. "You realize they're wrong?" Endo said nothing. For the first time, the silence around him felt heavier than any blow. The interrogator continued. "You said the Thunderbolt couldn't reach the Marianas. Yet here they are, flying over your head." The engines roared again above the bunker, a long metallic growl rolling through the concrete. Endo looked up, eyes wide. He had never heard them so close. In that sound he heard the death of certainty. War is not fought only with weapons. It is fought with information, data, interpretation, belief. Japan's defeat in the air did not begin with the loss of planes. It began with the loss of truth. Numbers had lied and men had obeyed them. By mid-1944, the empire's intelligence network was collapsing under its own contradictions. Reports contradicted each other, messages crossed paths, entire air campaigns were built on misread intercepts. Tokyo continued to issue confident statements about victory even as the sky above the Pacific turned into an American highway. To the Americans it seemed absurd. How could a nation so disciplined, so methodical, fail to see what was happening? But inside Japan's command structure, truth had become dangerous. To question the reports was to question the emperor's wisdom. And no one dared do that. Endo's numbers were not simply wrong. They were inevitable. In that dark cell, as the air outside filled with the roar of thunderbolts, he thought of the men who had trusted his data. Pilots who died defending positions that should never have existed. Soldiers who waited for enemy squadrons that never came, while death arrived from another direction. He imagined their faces and for the first time he envied them. Somewhere far above, the planes turned east, sunlight glinting on their wings. Endo closed his eyes and counted the seconds between the fading sound and the silence that followed. It was then that he understood what every spy, every soldier, every empire must eventually face. Information is not power. It is only truth that has been seen clearly. And truth, once ignored, becomes a weapon turned inward. He whispered a prayer, not for the emperor, but for the truth that had been buried beneath loyalty and pride. Outside, the air began to tremble again, and this time the roar was louder. The first bombs fell before dawn. The walls shook. Dust drifted down from the ceiling like ash. Endo pressed his forehead against the cold floor and thought about the numbers that had brought him here. Each one had once meant certainty, control, knowledge. Now they were ghosts. He realized that wars are not lost in moments of explosion, but in moments of misunderstanding. Not when armies fall, but when facts do. The thunderbolts came in waves. Precision, speed, power, all things his reports had denied. And with each pass the sound became less like war and more like revelation. In the flicker of dawn, as flames licked the horizon, Endo lifted his head. He could almost see it, the shape of the truth he had missed, the future he had helped destroy. In Tokyo, radio operators still trusted the numbers. Commanders still believed in the charts. The lie had momentum. And by the time reality reached them, the empire's skies would already belong to someone else. Before the smoke cleared, before the silence returned, a voice inside Endo spoke one last order. An order that no one had given him, but one he now understood completely. Never again mistake confidence for truth. Never again trust numbers without seeing the world they claimed to describe. He did not know if anyone would hear it. But he spoke it anyway. And as the light faded from the cell, the war outside moved on, cold and unstoppable, carried forward by the very lies that men like him had built. This was how an empire fell, not in defeat but in self-deception. If you're hearing this story now, remember it. Because the cost of false certainty is not history, it's a warning. Subscribe for more stories of how truth, when ignored, rewrites the fate of nations. Long before Lieutenant Endo sat in that dark cell on Tinian, the Empire of Japan had built a network meant to see everything. It stretched from the jungles of Burma to the steel docks of Yokosuka, from the mountains of Manchuria to the islands scattered like dust across the Pacific. Each agent, each operator, each wireless officer believed they were a single eye of a vast intelligence machine. Together they were meant to watch the world, to predict its storms before they arrived. But every empire builds its own kind of blindness. In 1939, as Europe plunged into chaos, Japan's intelligence leaders saw an opportunity. They would study Western warfare, absorb its methods and surpass them. The Bureau of Naval Intelligence, known as the Kaigan Gun Review, established what they called the 7th Section. On paper, it was dedicated to reconnaissance and data analysis. In truth, it was an echo chamber of ambition, an office where numbers became prophecy and doubt became treason. The men who joined it were disciplined, intelligent, and loyal. But loyalty in the wrong system is not a virtue. It is a prison. From the very beginning, the Japanese intelligence system valued hierarchy over accuracy. Reports passed upward through layers of approval, each officer trimming away uncertainty to please the next. By the time data reached Tokyo, it was clean, elegant, and false. The empire wasn't just deceiving its enemies. It was deceiving itself. Analysts inside the 7th section spoke in reverence of precision. They measured everything: engine pitch, wingspan, flight altitude. But what they lacked was skepticism. A report that confirmed expectation was accepted instantly. A report that contradicted it was revised. There was no room for contradiction in a nation taught that obedience was strength. The result was a mirror maze of numbers reflecting only what the empire wanted to see. By 1941, when the Pacific War ignited, this culture had hardened into dogma. Japanese agents stationed across Asia, Singapore, Manila, Rabaul, sent daily radio transmissions filled with confident figures about American aircraft. They described the P-40 Warhawk, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the early Hellcats and Wildcats with impressive certainty. Yet behind every number was guesswork. The agents had little access to actual machines. Most relied on observation from great distance, or on the testimony of frightened locals. They did not measure, they imagined. And when those figures reached Tokyo, no one questioned them. They were stamped, filed, and woven into strategy. To the Japanese high command, intelligence was not information. It was affirmation. Inside this closed world, the word truth began to lose its meaning. It became political, flexible, shaped to the contours of authority. Officers learned to write reports that pleased superiors, not reality. Those who spoke otherwise found themselves transferred, disgraced, or worse. In a system where saving face mattered more than saving lives, error became inevitable. The paradox was cruel. Japan had some of the most skilled intelligence minds in Asia, men trained in cryptography, linguistics, and aerial reconnaissance. But their brilliance was smothered by conformity. The empire demanded unity of thought. And unity, in the absence of truth, breeds disaster. When the first American Thunderbolts appeared in early 1943, Japanese observers noted their bulk, their strange shape, their massive radial engines. The reports called them monsters too heavy to fight. They assumed, reasonably perhaps, that such an aircraft could never rival the Zero's agility. But reason is not knowledge and assumption is not fact. Engineers at Republic Aviation were quietly rewriting the laws of air combat. The P-47's turbosupercharger gave it an advantage no Japanese pilot could match at high altitude. Its armor could absorb punishment that would rip a Zero apart. And as the war dragged on, American logistics ensured that each Thunderbolt flew with more fuel, more ammunition, more reach. Tokyo's intelligence memos continued to insist otherwise. Enemy fighter, limited range, low endurance, inferior in turning combat. Those words were copied, approved, and repeated across every major command. Even as pilots returned from the front with stories of near-invincible American planes, the official numbers did not change. To question the numbers was to question the empire itself. And so the machine continued to lie to itself, day after day, report after report. Across the Pacific, American intelligence officers were reading those same transmissions with growing astonishment. Codebreakers working under the Signal Intelligence Service had begun to intercept Japanese messages as early as 1942. Through painstaking decryption, they watched in real time as their enemy misunderstood them. Each intercepted telegram confirmed a new level of ignorance. It was almost surreal. Japan was conducting a shadow war against an opponent that already knew its moves, and worse, was misreading its own. In the offices of the U.S. Navy's Fleet Radio Unit in Hawaii, a young lieutenant named Robert Drake once described it as watching a blind man fight his reflection. Every time Tokyo updated its estimates, they were wrong. Every adjustment Japan made based on those estimates only deepened the illusion. And yet, it wasn't stupidity. It was structure. The system rewarded certainty and punished doubt. It demanded reports that confirmed strength, not vulnerability. It taught its officers that confidence was honor. And in that culture, truth became indistinguishable from pride. By mid-1943, cracks began to show. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea revealed Japan's inability to read Allied air tactics. Entire convoys were annihilated because intelligence had failed to predict bomber range. The reports that followed were sanitized, the numbers softened. Losses became minor setbacks. The same delusion infected aircraft analysis. Field agents continued to describe the Thunderbolt as slow, despite witnessing its devastating speed. They believed it was fragile, even as it tore through Japanese formations. They estimated its range at 200 miles, while pilots were flying it over 400. The numbers were wrong, but they were beautiful. and beauty was safer than truth. In a Tokyo office lined with maps and flags, Admiral Igaki Matome once looked at the intelligence summaries and smiled. "The Americans have built a bull," he said. "It cannot fly far and it cannot turn. It is a loud beast but not a threat." His subordinates nodded. None dared correct him. Months later those same bulls burned his fleet from the sky. If the Empire's intelligence network had been built on arrogance, it was sustained by fear. Officers like Endo were trapped between two impossibilities: disobeying command or disobeying reality. Most chose the latter. They called it loyalty. Even among the field spies, disillusionment spread in whispers. A few tried to send corrections, warnings that the Thunderbolt's range had doubled, that new American drop tanks allowed deep strikes from Saipan and Guam. Those messages rarely made it past censorship. Tokyo labeled them defeatist. The truth died quietly, buried under stamps and signatures. In the summer of 1944, as the Americans advanced through the Marianas, the Empire's blind confidence reached its peak. Japanese Air Command still believed the home islands were beyond the reach of escort fighters. They prepared for invasion, not bombardment. When the first P-47s appeared in formation with bombers over Iwo Jima, the illusion shattered. But even then, reports from the field insisted that these new planes must have been launched from carriers. The alternative, that land-based fighters had crossed an ocean, was unthinkable. In the span of months, Japan's defensive strategy collapsed. What had once been a fortress of data became a cathedral of lies. The tragedy was not only military. It was human. Behind every false report stood a man like Endo, educated, disciplined, certain. Each believed in the purity of his duty. None imagined that the very obedience that defined them would also destroy them. For the Americans, the victory seemed almost effortless. Their intelligence saw what the Japanese could not. Their analysts mapped not only enemy positions but enemy delusions. The P-47's reputation as a useless brute became one of the war's greatest deceptions. Not because it fooled the Allies but because it fooled the Axis. War, in the end, is a contest of perception. And in this war, perception was poisoned. By late 1944, Tokyo's leadership began to realize the scale of the failure. Memos circulated quietly, suggesting that data inconsistencies had compromised operations. But no one took responsibility. In a culture that prized hierarchy, guilt flowed downward. Clerks were blamed, technicians dismissed, minor officers replaced. The structure remained intact. The machine survived but the truth did not. From his cell, Endo would never know that his own coded transmissions had become a case study in deception. In Allied briefings, his name appeared in quiet footnotes, proof that Japan's intelligence system had collapsed under its own illusions. He had been trained to believe that knowledge was power. But in the Pacific War, knowledge without truth was death disguised as logic. Every empire learns this lesson eventually. Some learn it in battle. Others learn it in silence. Japan learned it in numbers. And as those numbers turned to ash, the sky over the Pacific filled with the sound of truth, loud, mechanical, and unstoppable. In a windowless room deep inside a naval compound on Oahu, a group of American cryptanalysts sat around a table littered with radio transcripts. The air smelled of dust and coffee and sleeplessness. Every scrap of intercepted code from Japanese transmitters was a piece of a puzzle they were determined to solve. They didn't know the names of the men who sent those messages, but they knew their mistakes. And in those mistakes they saw the outline of victory. They called the project magic, and in the sterile hum of fluorescent light, history was being rewritten line by line. The Americans had learned not just to break Japanese codes, but to understand the mind that created them. The pattern was always the same: confidence without verification, precision without proof. The Japanese believed their numbers because they had to. The Americans believed in evidence. Among the analysts was a young woman named Frances Lang. She was 24, with sharp eyes and a memory that never seemed to forget a sequence once she'd seen it. Frances noticed what others missed: a rhythm in the transmissions, a kind of overconfidence baked into the way Japanese intelligence officers structured their messages. They never admitted uncertainty. Their codebooks lacked words for doubt. In one intercepted report, Frances found a line that made her pause: enemy aircraft type P-47, incapable of sustained flight beyond 200 miles. The date was March 1944. She smiled. That very week, she'd seen those same aircraft soaring past Oahu on their way to Guam, 400 miles without refueling. The enemy's blindness was not a mystery anymore. It was measurable. By exploiting that blindness, American strategists began to turn misinformation into a weapon. They learned to feed the machine false reflections of itself. Patrols were staged, radio chatter manipulated, dummy airfields built to mislead Japanese observers. If the Empire's intelligence network wanted numbers, the Americans would give them numbers carefully wrong. Deception became an art form. At an airfield on Saipan, ground crews painted serial codes on empty fuel drums and left them visible from high altitude. Japanese reconnaissance pilots dutifully reported massive fuel reserves. In truth, the drums were empty. The Empire's planners relaxed, assuming the enemy's supply lines were stretched thin. When the Americans advanced again, the blow was catastrophic. Every act of deception worked because Japan's intelligence culture refused to question what it saw. The Americans understood this instinctively. They didn't need to outsmart the enemy. They only needed to let him trust his own illusions. The P-47 Thunderbolt became the perfect instrument for this strategy. Its sheer size and noise made it visible, intimidating, impossible to ignore. But beneath that brute exterior lay precision, an engine built for endurance, a frame designed for punishment, a machine that could take truth and turn it into motion. The Japanese called it the Raiden Killer. The Americans simply called it reliable. While Tokyo believed the Thunderbolt could not cross the Pacific, squadrons of them were already escorting bombers deep into enemy skies. Each new mission contradicted the Empire's math. Every mile flown beyond expectation was another nail in the coffin of false intelligence. In the control rooms of Guam and Tinian, American officers began to use the P-47 not only as a weapon of war, but as proof of concept, evidence that technology guided by data could outperform ideology guided by pride. For Lieutenant Colonel Howard Branson, commander of one of the first long-range Thunderbolt units, the realization came one night over the Philippine Sea. The weather was brutal, his formation scattered by crosswinds, and yet the engines held. The instruments stayed true. When they returned to base, he wrote in his logbook, "Machines tell the truth if we listen. Men lie because they can." Those words would later circulate through the Allied intelligence community as a quiet mantra. Back in Tokyo, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Pilots described enemy fighters appearing from impossible distances. Reports contradicted each other so violently that staff officers began to burn conflicting documents rather than explain them. The Ministry of War demanded accuracy but rewarded conformity. A few analysts tried to speak up, but their voices vanished into silence. In the autumn of 1944, an internal memorandum surfaced within the Naval Staff College. It warned that current enemy aircraft assessments may contain fundamental error. It was buried within days. The author was reassigned to a weather station in Hokkaido. The Empire was eating its own truth. For the Americans, the unraveling of Japanese intelligence became a mirror of their own evolution. They had entered the war with limited understanding of cryptography, radar, and aerial reconnaissance. By 1944, they had turned those disciplines into science. Machines began to speak to other machines, measuring not belief but fact. Every intercepted signal, every radar sweep, every photograph from high altitude became a line in a vast, coherent story. That story told them one thing: the war was already decided, not by courage or faith, but by comprehension. Inside the Pentagon, a senior intelligence officer named General Spatz summarized it with brutal clarity. "The Japanese fight with heart," he said, "but their heart blinds their head. We fight with numbers that mean something." By winter, the Americans had begun using their growing superiority in intelligence to accelerate Japan's collapse. Operations were timed to exploit the enemy's expectations. When reports from Japanese field agents claimed American airfields were short on fuel, fleets launched massive raids within hours, catching defenders completely unprepared. In one of the most studied examples, the Japanese military command in Manila believed that Thunderbolt units were grounded due to maintenance failures. In reality, those same aircraft were already in the air, crossing the South China Sea. The result was devastation. Communications hubs obliterated, radar stations burned, entire squadrons wiped out before they could take off. Every success was a quiet triumph of information over arrogance. For Frances Lang and her team in Hawaii, the data was both exhilarating and terrifying. They saw, in real time, how the enemy's refusal to face truth led to annihilation. Each decoded message was a glimpse into a system collapsing under its own certainty. She once wrote in a letter to her mother, "It feels like we are watching them drown in their own words." But Frances also sensed something deeper. The difference between victory and tragedy was not intelligence alone, it was humility. She knew that any system, even her own, could become what Japan had become, a machine that no longer questioned itself. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the Thunderbolt continued to evolve. Engineers replaced its older propeller with a new paddle blade design, pushing its climb rate higher. Its range grew with improved fuel management. It was no longer the beast the Japanese imagined, it was a predator that learned. Pilots loved it because it forgave mistakes. Mechanics loved it because it never lied. The gauges told the truth. The altimeter did not flatter. The engine did not boast. In an age of propaganda, the P-47 was pure objectivity in motion. By 1945, the Thunderbolt had become the sound of inevitability. Wherever it flew, it carried with it the ghost of Japan's misinformation, a sonic reminder that denial has consequences. Some American pilots even joked that the Japanese must have been sending their own generals bedtime stories instead of intelligence. But beneath the laughter was a grim respect. They knew that the men on the other side were not fools. They were trapped inside a system that mistook obedience for wisdom. War had turned both sides into reflections of what they valued most. For the Americans, it was the machine, a cold, relentless pursuit of fact. For the Japanese, it was the spirit, unquestioned loyalty, purity of intent. Both were powerful. Only one could adapt. On the eve of Japan's defeat, as B-29 bombers prepared for the final strikes, American intelligence officers reviewed the last intercepted transmissions from Tokyo. The messages were still confident, still full of numbers that denied reality. Even as cities burned, the empire continued to believe in its own mathematics. To the analysts who read them, it was like receiving letters from a vanished world, a civilization that could not see its own ending. Frances Lang closed her final report with a single sentence. They lost not because they were wrong, but because they refused to see they were. In that one line, the entire Pacific War was distilled into its purest form. The truth had been available to both sides. One measured it. The other edited it. When Lieutenant Endo's name resurfaced in American debriefs months later, it was not as an enemy but as an example, a man who had served faithfully in a system designed to mislead itself. His transmissions, carefully archived and translated, became required reading for new intelligence officers. The lesson was simple. Information is meaningless without honesty. Historians would later call it the intelligence paradox. The more data an empire gathers, the easier it becomes to mistake volume for understanding. Japan had built one of the largest spy networks in Asia, yet it drowned in its own reports. As the war neared its end, the Americans did not celebrate. The victory felt inevitable but also hollow. They had seen the cost of lies, and they knew it was not unique to the enemy. Every machine, every code, every number could one day become a weapon against its creator if truth was neglected. In the quiet aftermath, as the last Thunderbolts returned from missions over the Pacific, the sound of their engines faded into something almost human, a reminder that even in war clarity is rare and honesty is fragile. The world had changed. The age of blind faith had died in the noise of the machines that refused to lie. The war was ending, but inside Tokyo's intelligence rooms, no one dared say it aloud. The walls were covered with maps marked in red ink that meant nothing now. Every line was outdated. Every arrow pointed to a place already lost. Yet the officers continued to gather each morning, pressing pencils to paper, pretending that the empire still had eyes. Lieutenant Satoshi Endo's name had been erased from the reports. Officially he was missing. Unofficially he was a ghost, one of hundreds of officers who had vanished somewhere in the Pacific, swallowed by a system that no longer acknowledged failure. His superiors had burned his final transmissions, but the memory of them lingered like static. The empire still repeated his numbers, unaware that they had led it into blindness. By early 1945, Japan's intelligence network had become a theater of ritual. Messages arrived from the field filled with optimism that no one believed. They were read aloud in measured tones, stamped with official seals, and filed into cabinets that no one opened again. The officers performing these duties no longer sought truth. They sought survival. Colonel Tanaka, one of the senior analysts in the Naval Staff Office, had once been known for his precision. Now he sat at his desk each morning, reading the latest air defense reports with a kind of numb detachment. The numbers never matched reality. The reports described minor losses, where entire squadrons had been annihilated, temporary setbacks where cities no longer existed. He corrected nothing. He simply wrote, confirmed. He understood that the truth had become irrelevant. In February, a young intelligence officer approached him with trembling hands, carrying a dossier. Inside were intercepted communications, American from Guam and Tinian. The officer had translated them overnight. "Sir," he whispered, "the enemy is preparing a new offensive. Long-range escorts, P-47 units, will accompany bombers directly over Tokyo." Tanaka stared at the pages. "Impossible," he said quietly. "The Thunderbolt cannot fly that far." "But sir," the officer insisted, "the reports?" Tanaka raised a hand. "Then the reports are wrong." He signed the file, marked it classified, and ordered it destroyed. The next morning the Thunderbolts arrived. From his window, Tanaka saw them glinting in the winter light, each one a reflection of everything he had refused to believe. He watched in silence as the city trembled, as fire bloomed across the skyline, as the Empire's own denial burned above him. The machine had finally devoured its own architects. In underground bunkers across Japan, the remaining intelligence divisions continued to function like corpses that hadn't realized they were dead. Orders were transmitted to outposts that no longer existed. Agents sent reports from regions already occupied by the Americans. Tokyo still spoke the language of control, but it was speaking to ghosts. For the men inside those rooms, the collapse was not sudden. It was slow, quiet, and deeply human. Doubt crept in like smoke. Officers avoided each other's eyes. Conversations became whispers. The truth was everywhere, yet no one could say it aloud. The Empire's obsession with perfection had made imperfection invisible. Endo's story was whispered among captured soldiers in American camps. Some said he had confessed everything before his death. Others said he had refused to speak at all. In truth, the Americans had long stopped interrogating him. They didn't need his secrets. They already knew the shape of Japan's blindness. What they wanted to understand was how an entire nation could lie to itself so completely. The answer lay in culture. To the Japanese mind, truth was not a matter of fact. It was a matter of harmony. A report that caused discord was not truth, even if it was accurate. A report that preserved unity was truth, even if it was false. Within that philosophy, numbers lost meaning. They became instruments of order, not understanding. The Empire had created a world where being wrong was acceptable as long as one was wrong together. When the first American bombers appeared over Tokyo with P-47 escorts, many officers refused to look out the window. To see was to acknowledge. To acknowledge was to betray. Inside one intelligence office, a lieutenant began to laugh. It was a thin, exhausted sound, the kind that belongs more to despair than humor. "They said it couldn't be done," he muttered. "They said the Thunderbolt was useless." No one responded. The laughter echoed off the walls until it broke into sobs. Somewhere in the rubble of Tinian, Endo sat in his cell listening to the same engines. He no longer prayed. He no longer hoped. He only listened. Each roar was a confirmation, each explosion a punctuation mark at the end of his life's work. In those final months, the American intelligence community documented every Japanese transmission with surgical precision. They had begun to classify errors the same way they classified enemy weapons. Category 1 deception, systemic confirmation bias, operational delusion. Each phrase became a technical term, a new lexicon for understanding how nations could die of their own lies. The analysts no longer spoke of victory in terms of battles. They spoke in terms of information integrity. At the National Archives in Washington, rows of decoded Japanese messages filled steel drawers. Frances Lang read through them long after the war's outcome was certain. She noticed the pattern. The tone of Japanese messages changed subtly over time. Early in the war they were confident. Midway through they were analytical. By 1945, they were poetic, desperate fragments of men trying to justify the end. One message, intercepted in April, read, "We continue to fight with spirit, though the world denies us. The Thunderbolt's shadow reaches even our dreams." Frances paused over that line for a long time. To her, it was more than a signal. It was confession. She realized that the war had ceased to be about territory or machines. It had become a philosophical reckoning between two ways of seeing reality. One side measured it. The other mythologized it. In the skies over the Pacific, the P-47 had become more than an aircraft. It was a manifestation of verification, an embodiment of what happens when facts are allowed to evolve while faith stands still. By summer, Japan's intelligence headquarters were little more than rooms of smoke and paper. Officers wrote reports out of habit, even as the electricity flickered and typewriters jammed from ash in the air. A few younger men began to write the truth again, quietly in private journals. One such entry recovered years later read, "We are not blind. We are afraid to see. The Thunderbolt flies because it accepts what it is. We fall because we refuse to." Those words never reached Tokyo. They were never meant to. But they carried the essence of what the empire had forgotten, that truth is not obedience and accuracy is not arrogance. In August 1945, when the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, the shock inside Japan's intelligence community was not only from destruction, but revelation. The impossible had happened again. Every calculation, every assumption, every comforting lie collapsed into silence. The officers who survived gathered in stunned rooms, surrounded by the ruins of their certainty. They realized that their defeat had been written years before, in the numbers they had refused to correct. It was not the bomb that ended their empire. It was the arithmetic of denial. Endo did not live to see that day. He was executed quietly on Tinian weeks before Japan's surrender, accused of treason by the very army that had trained him to lie. The Americans did not intervene. There was no reason to. His story had already told itself. In the end, he died believing one final truth, that the empire he had served no longer existed, except in the fragments of false data scattered across burned maps and broken radios. For the Americans who studied his life, he became both warning and mirror. His loyalty was not evil. It was ordinary. And that made it dangerous. When General Spaatz received the final intelligence summary of the Pacific Campaign, he read it in silence, then wrote in the margin, "They built a system that could not see. We must never do the same." Those words would echo through decades of military doctrine, long after the war had faded into textbooks. But the lesson was larger than war. It was about the fragility of perception, the human tendency to shape truth to fit comfort, and the slow, quiet way that empires end, not with explosions, but with reports stamped, approved, that should have been stamped wrong. In the ashes of Tokyo, surrounded by the hum of generators and the scent of wet paper, a handful of surviving intelligence officers began to gather what remained of their records. They burned some, buried others, and left a few behind for the victors to find. It was not shame that drove them. It was the faint, belated desire to tell the truth one last time. They had lived inside a world built from numbers, and they had believed those numbers were real. But when the world fell apart, only silence remained, and in that silence, truth finally returned. No longer written. No longer spoken. Just known. When the war ended, the world returned to sound. Engines faded, fires burned out, and what was left was the quiet hum of rebuilding. Japan lay in ruins, not only in its cities but in its understanding of itself. The empire that once measured its destiny in precision and pride now faced the one thing it had never prepared for: reflection. In the months following surrender, Allied officers entered the surviving intelligence buildings in Tokyo. The rooms smelled of dust and smoke. Papers lay scattered across the floors, blackened from half-hearted attempts at destruction. On one wall, a faded chart still hung, a comparison of Allied aircraft speeds. At the top, the P-47 Thunderbolt was listed at 350 miles per hour, limited endurance. Beneath it, someone had drawn a thin red line through the words and written a single note in the margin: untrue. That word, simple and devastating, was the Empire's epitaph. For the Americans cataloging the ruins, it was a moment of strange intimacy. They had fought an enemy they no longer hated. The men who had built Japan's intelligence system were gone, but their errors remained, etched into the margins, the equations, the coded dreams of a world that could not face reality. Among those who studied the recovered documents was Frances Lang. She had come to Tokyo as part of the post-war intelligence review, tasked with translating and analyzing the final months of Japanese communications. She spent her days in silence, surrounded by the ghosts of data. Every file she opened felt like a conversation with the past. Every translation carried the echo of a man like Endo, diligent, obedient, certain. One afternoon she found a journal among a pile of debris. Its pages were damp, the ink blurred. It belonged to a junior intelligence officer, name unknown. The entries were short, detached, almost mathematical. But the last page stopped her. "I no longer trust the numbers," it read. "They comfort me but they do not save me. Truth lives somewhere beyond what I can measure." Francis closed the book and sat for a long time without moving. Outside, the city murmured with the sound of reconstruction. Hammers, footsteps, the slow rhythm of life returning. She understood then that truth had not been destroyed in war. It had only been forgotten, buried beneath obedience, waiting for silence to uncover it again. In the years that followed, the story of Japan's failed intelligence network faded from public memory. It became a footnote in military archives, a cautionary tale whispered in classrooms and command centers. But among historians it remained a symbol, a mirror held up to every nation that believed it could control reality through data alone. The lesson was not about Japan nor even about war. It was about the human tendency to mistake information for wisdom, loyalty for truth. It was about how certainty becomes a form of blindness when it refuses to see beyond itself. Decades later, as the Cold War unfolded and new machines began to think for men, the same question returned in a different form. Could systems built on numbers remain honest? Could truth survive in a world where facts were filtered through ideology, algorithms, and pride? In quiet rooms filled with blinking screens, the same silence that once surrounded Endo seemed to echo again. A new generation of analysts studied the same principles that had destroyed the empire he served. Confirmation bias, political distortion, the seduction of certainty. They gave these things modern names, but their essence was ancient. Every empire believes it is immune to illusion. Every empire discovers, too late, that illusion is its foundation. The P-47 Thunderbolt was retired long ago, its engines silent, its wings displayed in museums. But what it represented, the triumph of truth through adaptation, remains alive. It was never just a machine of war. It was a monument to verification, to the simple, unglamorous act of testing belief against fact. When pilots climbed into its cockpit, they trusted its instruments more than their instincts. That trust, grounded in evidence, became the dividing line between survival and destruction. It is the same line that separates wisdom from arrogance, science from superstition, reality from wishful thought. For Lieutenant Endo, that line was crossed long before his capture. He had built his world from numbers that confirmed what he wanted to believe. When those numbers betrayed him, he blamed himself, not the system that demanded lies. He died without understanding that truth had always been there, clear, indifferent, waiting. History remembers men like him not as villains but as warnings. Their stories remind us that deception begins not with the enemy, but with the desire to be right. Every lie we tell ourselves becomes a step toward ruin. Every truth we ignore becomes a shadow that follows us until the end. In modern intelligence circles, there is a phrase whispered among analysts when data begins to contradict expectation. Remember Tinian. It means, remember the moment when certainty killed an empire. Remember the cell, the silence, the numbers that lied. Frances Lang retired in 1965. On her last day, she placed that anonymous Japanese journal on her desk and wrote a final note on its inside cover. Truth has no side. It waits for whoever will face it. She left the building without looking back. Outside, the city of Tokyo had transformed. Neon lights, steel towers, the endless hum of modern life. But beneath the surface, in archives and memories, the ghosts of false numbers still whispered. Their lesson was timeless. Empires rise on conviction. They fall on correction. The camera of history does not blink. It records without mercy, without judgment. What it captures is what was. And in that unflinching light, every lie, no matter how noble, eventually dissolves. As night settles over the Pacific once more, the sound of the old Thunderbolt still echoes faintly across time. Not the sound of war but of warning. The voice of a machine that never lied. The truth, once ignored, never truly disappears. It waits. It listens. And when the silence returns, it speaks. And so this story ends where it began, in quiet. The kind of quiet that hums before a storm. Only now, the storm is knowledge, and the silence that follows is understanding. Remember this story. Because the cost of false certainty is not just history, It is the future repeating itself. Subscribe for more stories that reveal the truths history tried to hide.